My name is Sera Voss, and I am 38 years old. When I was 22 years old, my parents sat me down at the kitchen table and asked me to sign a document. My father had a pen already uncapped. My mother had made coffee. The document was a co-signer agreement for a business loan of $340,000. They explained it in the way they explained most things, efficiently, with the details they wanted me to have, and not the ones they didn't. The bank required a co-signer with a clean credit history. Mine was clean because I was 22 and had never borrowed anything. It was a formality, they said. Your name on the paper means nothing as long as the business performs. We've been in business for 18 years. The business always performs. I signed. I was 22 years old and I trusted them, and I signed. And then I went back to my life and forgot about it for 13 years. What I did not know at 22, what my parents chose not to tell me, was that the business had not been performing for the 2 years before that loan. That the $340,000 was not an expansion loan. It was a rescue. That the signature they needed from me was not a formality, but a transfer of liability, moving a portion of their risk onto a 22-year-old who didn't know what she was absorbing. I did not know any of this until I was 35 years old, and a collections attorney named Philip Wren called my cell phone on a Tuesday morning and told me that Voss Family Hardware had filed for bankruptcy, and that as a co-signer on the primary business loan, I was personally liable for the outstanding balance, which at that point, with 13 years of interest and refinancing I had never been notified about, was AP exception. Before I tell you what happened when my own attorney started pulling documents, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I love knowing where you're listening from. Now let me take you back 22 years to a kitchen table in Dunmore, Pennsylvania, and the last moment I trusted my parents completely. I grew up in hardware, not metaphorically, literally inside a hardware store. Voss Family Hardware had been open since 1976, founded by my grandfather Edmund Voss, who had the specific vision of a man who understood that a town needs a place where problems get solved, not a big box store. A place where someone who knew the answer stood behind a counter and gave it to you. My father, Dennis Voss, had taken over from Edmund in 1989. He was good at the business in the ways that mattered. He knew every product, every supplier, every regular customer by name. He was not good at it in the ways that also matter. The books, the margins, the particular discipline of knowing when to hold and when to cut. He was a man who believed that relationships were the business and that the numbers would follow the relationships. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. My mother, Carol, handled the administrative side, invoicing, payroll, the quarterly taxes. She was organized and careful, and she kept the operation running in the way that operations run when someone competent is managing the details. What she was not good at, what neither of them was good at, was telling the truth about money when the truth was uncomfortable. I had an older brother, Daniel, 4 years older, already working in the store full-time by the time I was in high school. Daniel was being groomed for succession the way oldest sons in family businesses are groomed for succession, visibly, deliberately, with the assumption of everyone in the room. I was never part of that plan. I was going to college. I was going to become something outside the store. That was what my parents wanted for me, or said they wanted. And I believed them because believing them was easier than noticing the ways the belief required me not to look too carefully. I went to college 2 states away. I studied business administration, which felt like a practical choice, and was also, I understood later, a way of trying to build a version of competence my family never modeled for me. I was a good student. I was careful with money. I had no debt because I had scholarships and 2 part-time jobs, and the specific financial anxiety of someone who grew up watching their parents not talk about numbers. The summer after my junior year, I came home and noticed things I hadn't noticed before. The store was quieter than I remembered. The supply shelves in the back were less full. My father had stopped carrying 2 lines of products that used to move well. When I asked about it, he said the market was shifting and they were adapting. My mother changed the subject to my courses. I went back to school. I graduated the following spring. I came home for the summer to figure out what came next. That was when they sat me down at the kitchen table. My father explained the loan. Expansion capital, he called it. Opportunity in the market. The bank wanted a co-signer with clean credit. Formality, standard practice. He said all of this with the confidence of a man who had decided what he was going to say and was saying it. My mother poured coffee. She didn't say much. I remember noticing that she didn't say much and filing it away without understanding what I was filing. I asked a few questions. I asked what the loan was for specifically. My father said inventory and equipment upgrades. I asked what the monthly payment was. He told me a number that sounded manageable. I asked what happened if I needed my credit for something. He said this wouldn't affect me at all as long as the business was current, which it always was. I signed. My mother collected the document. She put it in a folder without looking at me directly. I went back to my life. I got a job in Philadelphia. I built something. I moved into an apartment, then a better apartment, then a small house I bought at 31, with the specific pride of someone who has done something entirely on her own. I had a good credit score. I had savings. I had the life my parents said they wanted for me when they sent me to college. I called home every Sunday. I went back for holidays. The store was always fine when I asked about it, and I always asked about it, and the answer was always fine, doing fine. I did not know that the original loan had been refinanced in 2014. 3 years after I signed. I did not know that when they refinanced, they rolled in additional borrowing. I did not know that my co-signer's status had transferred automatically to the new loan agreement, which my parents had signed on behalf of Voss Family Hardware, and which included my name on the original obligation without requiring my separate signature on the new document because of the way the refinancing was structured. I did not know any of this because nobody told me. I did not know that the business had been in technical default twice in the years that followed, brought back each time by emergency measures that kicked the problem forward without solving it. I did not know that by the time Philip Wren called me, it had been genuinely failing for 3 years, and that the bankruptcy filing was not a surprise to anyone except me. Philip Wren called me on a Tuesday. I was at my desk. I had a good job. Project management at a mid-sized firm, the kind of work that requires the specific skill of holding many moving pieces simultaneously without losing any of them. I was good at my job. I picked up the phone because I always pick up unknown numbers, a habit from years of client work. He said, "Is this Sera Voss?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Miss Voss, my name is Philip Wren. I'm a collections attorney representing First Regional Bank. I'm calling regarding your co-signer obligation on the Voss Family Hardware business loan. Account number," and he read a number I didn't recognize. I said, "I'm sorry." "My co-signer what?" He said, "The outstanding balance on the account is currently $218,000. As the co-signer of record, you are jointly and severally liable for this amount following the bankruptcy filing of Voss Family Hardware LLC. I said, "That can't be right." He said, "I understand this may be unexpected. I'd encourage you to consult with an attorney. You'll be receiving formal written notice at your home address within the week." He gave me a reference number and hung up. I sat at my desk for a very long time. The office moved around me. Phones rang. Someone laughed at something in the hallway. I stared at the reference number I had written on a post-it note in my own handwriting. $218,000. I called my father. He answered on the second ring. He knew why I was calling. I understood that from the first word, the way he said my name, Sera, with the particular flatness of someone who has been waiting for a call and hoped it would not come in exactly this form. I said, "Dad, a collections attorney called me this morning. Philip Wren, First Regional Bank. He said I was going to call you." I said, "When?" He said, "Soon. This week. We filed last Thursday. It happened fast at the end." I said, "Dad, I co-signed a loan 13 years ago. You told me it was a formality." He said it was supposed to be. I said, "You refinanced it," without telling me. A pause. He said, "The bank transferred the co-signer obligation automatically. We didn't think. We assumed it would resolve before it got to this." I said, "You assumed." He said, "Sera, we didn't plan for this. Nobody plans to fail." I said, "Nobody plans to fail. But some people plan to have their 22-year-old daughter absorb the risk of their failure without knowing she's doing it." He didn't say anything. I said, "I'm going to call an attorney." He said, "Sera." I said, "I'll call you after I talk to an attorney." I hung up. I sat at my desk. Then I went to the bathroom and stood at the sink and ran cold water over my wrists until I stopped feeling like the walls were moving. My attorney's name was Janet Reeves. She had been my attorney for 3 years, handling the closing on my house and a contract dispute with a contractor who had done bad work on my kitchen. She was precise and unhurried, and she had the specific quality I value most in people I hire. She told me the truth, even when the truth was not what I wanted to hear. I called her that afternoon and explained the situation as clearly as I could. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Send me everything you have. The original agreement, anything the bank has sent you, and anything you can get from your parents about the refinancing." I said, "I don't have anything. I never received any documentation after the original signing." She said, "Then we'll request it from the bank. Give me a few days." She called me back on Friday. She said, "I've reviewed what the bank provided. The original co-signer agreement from 2011 is standard. You signed it. It's valid. The refinancing in 2014 is more complicated." I said, "How more complicated?" She said, "When they refinanced, the bank used what's called a continuing guarantee clause in the original agreement. It's a provision that extends your co-signer obligation automatically to any subsequent financing on the same account. It's legal. It's also, and I want to be direct with you, the kind of clause that a 22-year-old without legal counsel would not have understood, and that your parents almost certainly understood, or should have understood when they had you sign." I said, "Did they know the clause was there?" Janet paused. She said, "The document is clearly written. A reasonable adult reading it carefully would have seen it. Whether they read it carefully or understood its implications is something I can't tell you for certain. What I can tell you is that if you had been properly advised before signing, you would have been told about that clause. And you would have had the right to add a limitation, a cap on your exposure, a sunset provision, something. You weren't advised. You signed a document with open-ended liability that your parents have been drawing on for 13 years without telling you." I said, "What does that mean for what I owe now?" She said, "On the face of it, you're jointly liable for $218,000. But I want to look at a few things before we accept that number. The refinancing raised the balance. If the original loan was for $340,000 and the current balance is $218,000 after 13 years of payments, something doesn't add up cleanly. I want to pull the full payment history and the terms of the 2014 refinancing." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because if the refinancing increased the principal, if your parents borrowed additional money against the existing loan when they refinanced, then part of what you're being asked to pay is debt they took on after the original agreement without your knowledge or consent. That additional borrowing may not be covered by the continuing guarantee, depending on how it was structured." I said, "You're saying some of this might not be mine." She said, "I'm saying it's possible. Let me pull the documents." I want to pause here, because what I felt in that moment was not relief exactly. It was something more complicated. The possibility that some of the debt might not be mine was also the confirmation that my parents had continued borrowing against an obligation attached to my name for 13 years. That every time they refinanced, every time they extended the loan, every time they kicked the problem forward, they had done it with my credit, my liability, my name, without telling me. That is what I sat with while Janet pulled the documents. She called me back the following Thursday. I was home. I had taken to leaving work on time that week, which I never do, because I needed the evenings to be somewhere quiet with my thoughts. She said, "I have the full loan history. I want to walk you through it." She did. It took 40 minutes. I took notes in a notebook I still have. The original loan in 2011 was $340,000. By 2013, the balance had been reduced to $290,000 through regular payments. In March 2014, the loan was refinanced. The new principal was $380,000. I said, "They borrowed more." Janet said, "They rolled the existing balance plus $90,000 in new borrowing into the refinanced loan. The new money was used, based on the business records I've now obtained, for equipment purchases and a renovation of the store's retail floor." I said, "And my co-signer obligation covered that." She said, "The bank's position is yes, under the continuing guarantee. Our position is more nuanced. The original guarantee was for a specific loan and a specific principal. The 2014 refinancing created a materially different obligation, higher principal, different terms, new purposes. There's a reasonable argument that the continuing guarantee should not have extended to the additional $90,000 without your explicit consent to the new terms." I said, "Have you made that argument to the bank?" She said, "Not yet. I wanted to discuss it with you first. But there's more." I said, "Tell me." She said, "The 2014 refinancing was not the only one. They refinanced again in 2018. At that point, the balance was approximately $280,000. The new principal was $310,000. I said, they borrowed more again. She said, another $30,000. For operating expenses, based on the records. I said, so the total amount they borrowed after the original loan, against my co-signer obligation without telling me, is $120,000. She said, correct. The current balance of $218,000 includes principal that was originally your obligation and principal that arguably should never have been attached to your name. I sat in my kitchen with my notebook and my very cold cup of tea and looked at the number I had written, $120,000. I said, what are my options? Janet said, a few. We can negotiate with the bank directly, arguing that your exposure should be limited to the original obligation and that the additional borrowing was not covered by your guarantee. If the bank agrees, your liability could be significantly reduced. If they don't agree, we can litigate. It's a viable argument, but litigation is expensive and uncertain. Or, she paused. I said, or what? She said, we can pursue your parents. I said, for what? She said, for indemnification. If you are required to pay any portion of this debt, you have a claim against your parents for the portion that resulted from their actions, specifically, borrowing against your obligation without your knowledge or consent, and misrepresenting the nature of the original agreement. That's not a small claim. Depending on what we can establish about what they knew when they had you sign in 2011, it could also support a claim for fraudulent inducement. Fraudulent inducement. I wrote those two words in my notebook. I sat with them for a long time. Then, I said, I need to think about this. Janet said, of course. But Sera, the bank is moving. We have about 3 weeks before they escalate to a judgment. Whatever we do, we need to start soon. I called my mother that night. Not my father, my mother. She answered on the first ring. She said, Sera, I know why you're calling. I said, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me directly. She said, okay. I said, when you had me sign that agreement in 2011, did you know about the continuing guarantee clause? A silence, longer than I wanted. Then she said, your father's attorney explained the documents to us. Yes. I said, did you know it meant that any future refinancing would automatically include me? Another silence. She said, we knew it covered future arrangements on the same account. I said, and you didn't tell me. She said, we didn't think it would come to this. I said, Mom, that's not what I asked. She said, no, we didn't tell you. The kitchen was very quiet. I could hear the refrigerator humming, a car outside, the specific sound of a conversation you cannot unhear once you've had it. I said, did you tell me it was a formality because you believed it was a formality? Or because you needed me to sign and you knew I wouldn't if I understood what I was signing? The silence this time was the longest of any silence in that conversation or any conversation I'd had with my mother in my entire life. She said, we needed you to sign. I sat at my kitchen table for a very long time after that call. I had been asking the question for 3 weeks in various forms to myself and to Janet, and in the middle of the night when I couldn't sleep. I had been building the case for the answer. I had prepared for it intellectually, and I thought I had prepared for it emotionally. And I was wrong about the emotional part. My parents had known. They had sat across from me with an uncapped pen and a cup of coffee, and they had looked at their 22-year-old daughter who trusted them completely, and they had told her a formality was a formality, and handed her the pen. I didn't cry. I made a different kind of decision. I called Janet the next morning. I said, I want to negotiate with the bank first. Limit my exposure on the additional borrowing. But I want to document everything. Everything about what my parents knew in 2011. Everything about the refinancings. If I end up liable for any of this, I want the indemnification claim ready to file. Janet said, understood. I said, and Janet, I want it on the record, formally, that my parents misrepresented the nature of my obligation when they had me sign. Not for the lawsuit. For the record, she said, I'll prepare a formal demand letter to your parents' attorney requesting documentation of what they disclosed to you in 2011 and what their attorney advised them about the guarantee clause. That creates a paper trail. I said, good, she said, Sera. I want you to be prepared. Even with the strongest arguments, you may end up with some liability here. The original obligation was real. The bank may compromise on the additional borrowing, but they may not. I said, I know. She said, are you prepared for the possibility that you'll need to pay some portion of this? I said, I've been paying for it for 13 years. I just didn't know. The negotiation with the bank took 6 weeks. Janet was methodical and precise, and she built the argument the way good arguments are built, document by document, clause by clause, without drama. The bank's position going in was that the continuing guarantee covered all subsequent obligations, and that my liability was the full $218,000. Janet's counterposition was detailed and specific. She argued that the 2014 and 2018 refinancings had materially altered the original obligation, that the additional borrowings of $120,000 represented new debt that required explicit consent from a co-signer, and that the bank had an obligation to notify me of material changes to the guaranteed obligation, an obligation they had not fulfilled. That last part was the one the bank's attorneys did not enjoy, because Janet had found something in the state's banking regulations, a provision requiring lenders to notify guarantors of material modifications to a guaranteed obligation. The bank had sent notification to Voss Family Hardware LLC. They had not sent notification to me. They had not told me about the refinancings because I was a co-signer, not the primary borrower, and their internal process had not flagged me for notification, which was an oversight, which was documented, which became the center of Janet's argument. I want to be honest with you about what happened next, because I think the honest version matters more than the triumphant one. The bank did not fold. They are a bank. They don't fold. What they did was negotiate. After 6 weeks of back and forth and one mediation session that lasted 4 hours in a conference room with bad coffee and worse chairs, we reached a settlement. My liability was reduced to $78,000, the portion of the original 2011 loan that remained attributable to the initial principal after the bank acknowledged their failure to notify me of subsequent modifications. The $140,000 representing the additional borrowings and the interest attributed to them was removed from my obligation. $78,000. Real money. My money. Money I had not borrowed and had not spent and had not been told I was responsible for until a Tuesday morning phone call. Janet filed the indemnification claim against my parents the same week the bank settlement was finalized. I have to tell you something about that process, because it is the part that took the most out of me, more than the bank negotiation, more than the 6 weeks of mediation, more than the Tuesday morning when Philip Wren called me. My father called me the night Janet's letter arrived at their attorney's office. He said, "Sarah, you're suing us." I said, "I'm filing an indemnification claim. It's not the same as a lawsuit, but I understand why it feels like one." He said, "We're your parents." I said, "I know." He said, "We didn't do this to hurt you." I said, "I know that too." He said, "We made decisions under pressure, and we made them wrong, and we are so sorry, Sarah. We are so sorry for all of it." I said, "Dad, I believe you're sorry. I believed it the first time you said it, and I believe it now. But sorry doesn't pay $78,000. He said, "We don't have $78,000. I said, "I know. That's why there's a claim." He said, "We have nothing left. The business is gone. The building is the bank's. We have the house." I said, "Your attorney will explain the options." He said, "Sarah." I said, "Dad, I love you. I'm not doing this because I want to hurt you. I'm doing this because I spent 13 years as the silent guarantor of decisions you made without telling me, and when the bill came due, it came to me first. That's not how it should work." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "No, it isn't." That was the most honest thing my father said to me in the entire process. And it cost him something to say it. I could hear that it cost him something. My mother called me the following week, not to argue. She said she had been talking to their attorney, and she understood the claim, and she wanted me to know something. She said, "I want you to know that I have been ashamed of this since the day you signed that document. Not of you, of us, of the choice we made. I knew at the kitchen table that we were not being fair to you, and I poured the coffee anyway, and I said nothing, and I have not had a good night's sleep in 13 years. I said, "Mom." She said, "I'm not asking you to drop the claim. I'm asking you to know that it has been sitting on me this whole time." I said, "Why didn't you tell me after the fact, any time in 13 years? She said, "Because telling you would have meant making it real, and I could tell myself it would resolve, that you'd never know, that we'd pay it off before it ever touched you." I said, "It touched me on a Tuesday morning when I was 35 years old." She said, "I know. I'm sorry." I said, "I know you are, Mom." The indemnification claim settled 14 months after it was filed. My parents' attorney negotiated a structured arrangement. The details are private. What I will tell you is that it was not $78,000. It was less. It was what they had, structured over time, and it was what the situation could bear, and I accepted it. Because Janet told me that accepting it was the practical outcome and fighting for more would cost me more than the difference. I have accepted a lot of practical outcomes in the past 3 years. I want to be honest with you about where things stand with my parents now, because I've noticed that stories like this one tend to end in one of two ways: complete reconciliation or complete rupture. And my life has ended in neither. My father and I talk. Not every week. Not the Sunday calls we used to have. But we talk. He is a man who did something wrong and knows it and has no framework for carrying that knowledge gracefully because he was never taught how to carry things he couldn't fix. He tries. I can see him trying. I give him credit for the trying even when the trying is awkward and insufficient. My mother and I are closer than we were. Closer than we've been since I was young. Which surprised me, and I think surprised her. She is a woman who carried a secret for 13 years, and the carrying compressed something in her that had nowhere to go, and when the secret came out, even the way it came out, something decompressed. She is more honest with me now than she has ever been. About money, about the store, about my father, about herself. Daniel, my brother, is another story. Daniel knew. I found this out through Janet's document requests, a text exchange from 2014. Produced as part of the refinancing records between my father and Daniel discussing the new loan terms. Daniel had been involved in the 2014 refinancing. He had known about the continuing guarantee. He had said nothing to me. Daniel and I have not spoken since I found out. I don't know if we will. I leave that door exactly as open as it needs to be, which right now is barely cracked, and I don't apologize for that. Here is what I want to tell you about all of it. Not the resolution. The resolution is ongoing and incomplete, and probably always will be. What I want to tell you is something about the moment on a Tuesday morning when your life reveals a shape you didn't know it had. I was 35 years old. I had built something real: a house, a career, a credit score that represented 13 years of careful decisions. And in one phone call, I found out that I had been carrying a weight I didn't know about for all 13 of those years. That the stability I thought I had built on my own terms had a silent obligation attached to it that my parents had put there without my knowledge. The first thing I felt was terror. The second thing I felt was something colder and more clarifying. Because once you know the shape of a thing, you can work with it. The not knowing is what makes you helpless. The knowing, even the terrible knowing, gives you something to hold. I called an attorney. I pulled the documents. I asked the questions that needed asking, even when the answers were going to cost me something. I sat in a conference room for 4 hours with bad coffee, and I negotiated for my own life with the same precision I bring to every project I manage at work. And then I came home, and I called my mother, and I let her apologize, and I let myself receive the apology, without pretending it fixed everything or pretending it fixed nothing. That is the whole of what I know how to tell you. If you have ever signed something without understanding what you were signing, tell me in the comments. If you have ever found out that someone you trusted made a decision that used you without asking, tell me. If you are sitting somewhere right now with a piece of paper that has your name on it and you don't fully understand what it means, please talk to an attorney. That is the most practical thing I can leave you with. The second most practical thing is this. Knowing is always better than not knowing, even when knowing is hard. The not knowing is the thing that owns you. The knowing is the thing you can work with. I own my house. My credit score recovered. I have the $78,000 I paid in savings that I've been rebuilding since the settlement, and I'm nearly back to where I was. Nearly. And that nearly matters. That nearly represents 3 years of my savings and my sleep and my Sunday phone calls and my ability to trust my own history. I'm not pretending the nearly isn't there, but I'm here. I'm 38 years old, and I know the shape of my own life, and nothing in it is signed without me understanding what I'm signing. That's worth something. That's worth everything, actually. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment. Tell me what it brought up. Tell me your version of the kitchen table. I read everything, and I'll be here. Subscribe if you want more of these. And if someone you know needs to hear this, someone who has been asked to sign something they don't fully understand, someone who trusts people they maybe shouldn't trust completely, send this to them. It might be the most useful thing you do today. Until next time.